Hey guys, before we start anything, I would like to let you guys know that my shirts are coming out pretty soon. Zercast. I'm doing a limited run, so if you want to get one, you gotta snag it real quick. Yeah, I don't have too many. So today we have a very special guest. Her name is Kiana Loomis.
Hey
Is that
guys,
right? Am I pronouncing that right?
that is correct.
So tell them a little bit about yourself and what you do.
So I am a personal trainer, a bikini competitor, and I study anything fitness, nutrition, and physique related.
Mm-hmm.
I've been avid in the bodybuilding world for a couple of years. I train lots of clients from bodybuilders to everyday people to athletes, everyone in between. Um, and I'm currently down in San Diego working at Brett Contreras' gym, the Glute Lab. And yeah, that's kind of just an overall summary.
Okay, cool. When did you start training, and how many shows did you compete in since you started?
Well, I started my training never with any intentions to ever do a show. I actually came from a background of yoga, and prior to that, I had a pretty severe eating disorder, and eventually that's what sort of unfortunately introduced me to exercise in a not so healthy way. But over time, I started to kind of develop healthier habits with not only nutrition, but also started to use exercise more to my advantage instead of as something that was hindering my progress and hurting me. And I started to become really interested in the actual science behind it and how it could help me achieve my goals, not only physically, but also mentally and strength wise, and et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that started about 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Seven
then,
years. Wow, it's almost as long as I've been training. Seasoned veteran over here.
yeah, yeah, right. So much to learn still.
Yeah.
But um, then from there, I started, like I said, I got kind of more into yoga, and I actually started out my career as a yoga instructor. And I did that for a little bit, and then that quickly led me into personal training, which is sort of kind of what I was more passionate about, was working with people one-on-one and kind of delving into the science a little bit more and understanding how I could use what I was doing to really help people in their lives. And that's when I started becoming really more interested in bodybuilding. And I started private personal training at a gym back in Oregon, where I'm from, and it was a very avid bodybuilding gym called Genuine Fitness. The owner is Aaron Norton. He's very, very knowledgeable bodybuilder in the natural bodybuilding scene up there. And so that is kind of where I got interested in bodybuilding and physique training, and really started delving into that a little bit more, as well as kind of been tagging along with the nutritional side and moving more away from sort of the rigid patterns that I'd been following for my disordered eating and my disordered habits in the past, and started delving into the science of that a little bit more as well.
So how many shows did you say you'd done?
So at this point, I've done, I think, 5 shows, two full, like 2.5 full prep seasons with a couple shows each. I've done a few NPC shows and a few natural bodybuilding shows, natural tested shows with the INBF.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also did the amateur show at the Olympia, the Flex Model Bikini Search.
And you've done pretty well in those, right?
Yeah, I've placed
You placed
top.
first in almost all of them.
Well, I placed top 3 in all my shows. And then the Olympia, except the Olympia Model Search, which was like a crazy international show with like 73 girls in that class, I think, and I
Mm-hmm.
got fifth. So,
Got fifth.
yes,
So you compete in both NPC and natural.
yes.
So what are the sort of the differences that you've noticed competing in both of those federations? Which one do you tend to lean towards, and why?
Well, aside from the obvious aspects, I tend
Not
to
obvious to me. Lay it on me.
the obviously the athletes that you see show up at the non-natural federations are much just bigger and leaner, more muscular. A lot of the women are far less feminine. It's commonly thought that women in the bodybuilding world don't do drugs. It's just for the men, but that's actually very not true. There's I would say, especially in the direction that bodybuilding is going nowadays, most women, I would say, and that's kind of a broad generalization, but I feel it to be true. I'd say most women are taking some form of exogenous hormone, whether it be Anavar or clenbuterol or a more serious one. But you'll see women at non-natural shows that are much leaner, much more almost emaciated looking,
Yeah.
and much more muscular to the degree that it's almost impossible to reach naturally as a woman just based on the amount of testosterone and balance of sex hormones that we possess. Like our muscles just don't grow that big naturally. So exogenous hormones eventually become kind of a last resort at a certain point if you want to get any bigger.
Hmm.
And that, being a bikini competitor, my goal was never necessarily to get as big as possible or to get even as lean as possible. My goal was to maintain more of a feminine figure, maintain overall shape, obviously, work hard in the gym, look good, but maintain a healthy, attainable physique. And that is just not really the physiques that win and come on stage in a lot of NPC or non-natural bodybuilding shows. And so that is sort of why I tend to lean more towards the natural bodybuilding shows. Is not only am I supportive of natural bodybuilders 100%, but it's also just more of a look that is my personal goal.
Do you think you could achieve the look that they're looking for in the NPC shows without using performance enhancing drugs?
Well, I have done well in those shows, but I have, well, I guess I did place first in one, but I think that it depends on the show. I don't think, honestly,
Because
that
it's
I
less, it's less, bikini's less, they want less size, right? They want more condition. So
exactly
I feel like
bikini.
it's a look that you could achieve naturally without PEDs. So
Well, bikini is definitely the least muscular class that they're looking for.
hmm
That being said, it started out really as being what I was describing earlier, just kind of more feminine, maybe a little softer, but still lean, still flat stomach, little bit of curves, but like muscular curves, not like saggy curves.
okay.
And that's kind of how bikini started out, even in NPC. Back when it started, I think in 2009 was the first year they had the bikini class.
Yeah.
Um, the years go on, it's becoming more and more, it's just moving in a direction where judges are awarding leaner and harder and more muscular physiques, almost to the point where the look is not the same as bikini started out being.
hmm
And so nowadays, I feel like it's very, very, very difficult to make it to a high level as a natural bikini competitor in the NPC. Almost every girl I know who has gone pro and gone to the IFBB,
Are on PEDs.
some form of exogenous hormone. And sometimes it's not to a huge degree, and sometimes it's not necessarily the drugs that you would peg as the ones that would make you very muscular, but it does
hmm
still assist, even if it's just in assisting to maintain muscle mass while reaching the level of leanness that they're starting to look for.
Yeah. I wanted to touch base back with, go back to what you mentioned earlier with your eating disorder. What kind of eating disorder did you have if you're comfortable talking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was just, or not just, but it was anorexia. So no like purging or anything like that. But it was just very restrictive food habits, definitely not eating enough to support my body, sort of using it as a form of control and almost punishment in situations where I didn't have very much control
hmm
in areas, and food was kind of the one thing I could control, and I felt like it was the only thing I could just keep holding back on when everything else was kind of spinning out. And I think that that is where a lot of eating disorders, especially anorexia, kind of stem from naturally, whether people realize it or not.
Is it hard for you to eat some foods, or was it completely psychological on your end? Were you just like refraining from eating, or did the act of eating itself sound like it just didn't feel good for you to consume food?
It was a little bit of both. And I mean, it got to a point where I liked the feeling of being hungry. I felt like, oh, that's good. That means I'm getting skinnier. I'm getting leaner. I'm going to look better. I'm going to reach my goal body faster. Like, this is a good feeling. And then when I was full, I didn't like that feeling because mentally it signaled I was going to get fat. I wasn't going to look good. Had no self-control. I was bad. And it was also very much, my diet was very much clean eating. So I felt guilty about eating foods that wouldn't be pegged as whole, natural, healthy foods. And every time, regardless of whether it was a large amount of food or a small amount of food, just having a little bit of something that was unhealthy, I felt guilty, and I felt like I had no self-control, and I felt fat and all that stuff that comes along with the psychology of eating disorders.
So would you say over the years that it has still affected you? Is there like a kind of like a graph line of where like you're just slowly getting better and better at coping with it? Or does it still kind of impact you to the same degree that it did back in the day, and you're just kind of sustaining it a bit better with good habits? Or how has it affected you over the years?
That's a really good question, actually, and I think it's something that's ignored a lot of the times because people think, oh, this person used to have an eating disorder, but they don't anymore, so now all of their thoughts about food are totally fine and healthy. And I do still, to this day, have a tendency to stress eat and emotional eat. The difference is that now I'm a lot better at pegging, like if I turn to food for something, I'm able to stop and say, wait, I'm not hungry. Why am I doing this? What's going on? How can I solve it? Other than food, what are some non-food related stress relief activities that I can turn to? And on the other hand, I've developed a much healthier relationship with food, just via studying really how it affects the body, studying the science behind fat loss and the nutrition behind it, and kind of just gaining more knowledge has really been empowering in being able to understand, okay, these foods there's nothing wrong with these foods. There's nothing inherently wrong with food. Your body needs food for fuel, and if you want to fuel yourself as an athlete, whether you're playing on the court or the field or you're a bodybuilder, you need certain amounts of certain food. Mm-hmm. And it has nothing to do with you as a person or how much self-control you have. It's not punishment. It's also not a reward. A lot of people, especially in physique industries, tend to turn to food a lot of times as a reward. Like you'll hear about refeeds for bodybuilders and it's like the best day of the week, or you'll hear about what everyone's going to eat after a show and they're like rewarding themselves for all their hard work. And I also think that can start to become a really unhealthy habit because you're still, even though it's viewing food in a positive light, you're still driving what you eat. What you eat is driven by your emotions. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the problem lies.
So I sort of have two questions expanding off of this. So the reason why I came back to your eating disorder was having an eating disorder and both going on prep for a competition. Those are two, like going on prep's really hard in itself, but also having an eating disorder, does it feel like you have a dam that you're trying to hold off the entire time for if you were to let it slip a little bit, you'd go all out? Or, what has been some of the issues that have arisen off of that? And also, to add on to that, what kind of, not diets, but what sort of strategies have you used in contest prep as far as how you eat and how you moderate what you eat?
So, your first question relating to eating disorders and bodybuilding, I actually didn't become really avid in bodybuilding or wasn't even interested in bodybuilding until long after I had pretty much what I would consider recovered from my eating disorder. So my relationship with food was much healthier. I didn't feel the need to restrict in order to feel good about myself. I was much more comfortable with myself physically and emotionally and mentally. And so going into a bodybuilding prep, I didn't really have those restrictive tendencies anymore. That being said, going into a bodybuilding prep in and of itself is very restrictive. And so there were times during my bodybuilding prep when I would feel those restrictive habits coming back on. And it is very difficult to be able to moderate those because there's only a certain amount that you can really do, because bodybuilding is restrictive and you do need to restrict your diet. And so I had to keep tapping into that, but I also had to keep reminding myself that this is temporary. You're only restricting yourself to be on stage for this one show. This isn't how your life is. You're not restricting yourself for life. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really helpful strategy for me. And before I ever even got into bodybuilding, one of the things that helped me look at food in a more scientific and reasonable way was counting macros, and what's commonly referred to today as IIFYM, or if it fits your macros. Mm-hmm. So which is basically just quantifying the amount of food you eat, regardless of what the type of food is, by how many carbs, how much protein, and how many grams of fat you're taking in per day. And so as long as you're hitting in a certain ballpark range within all of those numbers, you can eat whatever types of food you want. You don't have to be restrictive in your food choices. And so that was a huge milestone for me in just realizing that in order to be healthy and in order to reach a certain goal physique, it really has very little to do with restricting and cutting out all quote unquote junk food or bad food, and more has a lot to do with moderation and just understanding how much fuel your body really needs and catering to that.
I know personally I sort of deal with the whole like body dysmorphia thing, especially since I got injured. But
I think almost everyone who's avid in the bodybuilding world does deal with that.
Yeah. What are some tools that you've used to kind of cope with that psychological aspect of this anorexia sort of situation, especially during prep? Like, what do you tell yourself all the time, or what kind of exercises do you go through?
Well, a lot of it, and it's still a struggle, just being involved in the physique world and industry. I think it's always going to be something that we do struggle with, is just the idea of trying to come away from constantly comparing yourself to other physiques and to other people and to where you think you should be and to where you feel like you should be. Something that's helped me a lot is like when I'm having a hard time or feeling like comparing myself a lot to other people, or why I'm not as good as this person or I don't look as good as that person, is just looking at where I've come from. Progress are huge, measurements are huge, and focusing more on that and how much progress I have made as opposed to how much more progress I quote unquote should have made, or how far I should be along. Just looking back at the progress I have made is really empowering and helps me to realize that something I'm doing is working, even if it's not. You're never going to be the best out there. So even if I'm not the best out there, I'm doing something right. And that's empowering.
So you're already very lean. So I have one initial question, then later I'll ask something else. But what do you have more difficulty with, the building phase or the cutting down phase when you're prepping or off season, or what do you have most difficulty with, putting on size or taking it down?
That's an interesting question because most people fall in one of the two categories. I have been through both. I have been a little bit chunkier for my size and dealt with struggling to come down, and that's sort of where my eating disorder developed. And then from there on out, my main goal was to gain shape and to gain muscle. And in order to do that, I just wanted to put some muscle on my frame, and that has proven to be very difficult for me. So I have a hard time putting on size. Obviously, this goes for anyone. If I just ate an unlimited amount of calories, I could probably put on a decent amount of size, but a good amount of it would be body fat. My body does not tend to love to cling on to muscle, and that's just based on my genetics. But it's also important to know that a lot of research shows that your body fat set point, or the place that your body will kind of default to, even if you have a day that's really high calorie or a day that's really low calorie, etc. The body fat percentage that your body will kind of default to can be based on genetics, but a lot of it is also based on
You're breaking up a little bit.
So research shows.
Okay, we're good.
Okay.
Keep going. Sorry.
Okay. So research shows that once you reach a certain body fat level, if you're able to maintain that amount of body fat level for around 2 years, that will be your new body fat set point. So if you are someone who genetically is a little bit chunkier, and then you get down to more of a normal body weight, and you're able to figure out a system that's healthy and maintainable, and you're able to maintain that for around 2 years, that will probably be about where your new body fat set point is. So you're not doomed by your genetics by any means. That being said, to answer your question, today and for a long time, my biggest struggle does come in more building muscle than leaning down.
Do you think more people would benefit from lean gaining over other forms of putting on size or whatnot?
I actually do. I think there's a fine line to be walking there, because you do need to be in a bit of a calorie surplus muscle. And you don't want to get to the point where you're trying to gain muscle, but you freak out if you don't have ab lines, because those two goals are counterintuitive. But at the same time, I think that the culture around bulking or massing tends to be taken a little bit too far, and people tend to just use it as an excuse to overeat, when really there is a certain point where you're just putting on a bunch of extra body fat, and it might even be inhibiting your ability to gain muscle.
So how many months out do you declare, like, okay, today I'm going to start cutting? And there's you, and then there's your clients too. So what do you usually look for when you're telling people or making a personal decision when you should start cutting for a show?
I think there's a lot of things to look at. First of all is dieting history. How much have you dieted in the past? How long have you dieted in the past? How successful have you been in the past? The less successful that you've been with dieting in the past, or the more often that you've dieted and then gained the weight back, the harder it's going to be to diet down again. So it's important to keep that in mind. Those will probably be the people that need a little bit of a longer cutting phase. It also depends on what you're cutting for. If you're cutting for a show, obviously it's going to be very different than if you're cutting for summer to look good in your bikini. So for a show, you're going to need a lot longer prep. Cutting just to lose a little bit of body fat, maybe about 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the person. Cutting for a show, I like to err on the side of caution and give it a little bit more time. And then if you're ahead of schedule, we can always add more food. But if you're behind schedule, it really sucks to have to cut huge amounts of calories when you're already stressed about trying to be lean enough for your show. So I tend to err more on the side of 16 weeks and up for show preps. And then depending on the person, and then if you're just like a general fat loss client, you're just like, I don't really have a specific goal. I just want to lose body fat, or I want to get down to a healthy body fat. Let's say you're an overweight or obese client. I have them dieting probably for about 20 weeks. And then I'll give people what's called a diet break, where I just bring them back up to maintenance calories, because dieting is stressful on your body, and you don't want to be dieting year round all the time. It's really, really hard on your body. And there's going to reach a point where you do plateau. So there is definitely merit in taking breaks from dieting, even if you still have some body fat to lose.
Are there any strategies that you have for when you diet? Because, like, personally, when I do cut, like, I give myself, like, I don't know, 3 months, 2-3 months, and I do cut, maintain, and that helps me keep my body, not in a position where it's getting used to a certain diet. I never hit a plateau or a wall because I'm constantly changing my diet. So is there something that you do that you benefit from the most?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really smart strategy, and I like to incorporate that a lot of times, especially for my clients who are looking to get a lot leaner, like doing a show prep like you. I refer to those as diet breaks.
Oh,
So
like you
they
just talked about. Yeah.
so you have a period of maybe um, for anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks where you're below maintenance calories, and then you bring it back up to maintenance calories for a week or so, and then you go back to below maintenance calories. Um, some people don't like that as much,
Hmm.
and for some people, I'll incorporate what's called refeeds. So I'll have them diet for 1 to 2 weeks and then have a day where they're much higher calorie. What happens with that is you tend to lose a lot of weight in that 1 to 2 weeks that you're dieting, maybe a little more so than would be ideal, in my opinion.
Hmm.
And then you might gain some weight back during that really high calorie day. But overall, you're kind of consistently,
Steady. Yeah.
yeah, you're consistently losing at an appropriate rate.
Okay. Is there anything that you learned from your last contest prep that you're going to utilize in your next one? Like, is there
Um,
something you learned about yourself, your body, how it works in your last cutting phase? Because I know every time I do a cut, it's a little different. So,
right. Well, that's an interesting question because I actually don't know if I'll ever compete again.
what I
That
was
being
actually going to ask you if you're when your next show is.
That being said, I think you're absolutely right. There's always something to be learned from a show prep, which is part of the reason I like it so much.
Hmm.
And one big thing I did learn about myself in the past and kind of delved into the research on this a little bit more is in my last show prep that it's generally a little, especially if one of your goals is maintaining as much muscle as possible while getting very lean. Um, my body personally, and I've found a lot of my clients' bodies tend to respond a little bit better to less food, less cardio, as
Hmm.
opposed to trying to keep as much food as possible and just burning yourself to the ground with it. Because there does become a point where there's what's called the interference effect, where if you're doing a certain amount of cardio, you're going to be interfering with the amount of muscle that you can gain or maintain.
Hmm.
Um, and then it's cardio is stressful on your body, so it will raise your cortisol levels, and it could even interfere with your strength training sessions. So obviously, if your performance is going down in the gym, you're going to be more apt to lose muscle. So I sort of started to err more towards the side of instead of adding more cardio, just taking away 100 or 200 extra calories. Obviously, there becomes a certain point, maybe when you're in a show prep, where that's not really an option anymore. Maybe you're down really low already in calories, and cardio can be a useful tool, but it's not always necessary.
How did you come to the conclusion that you weren't going to compete again?
Um, well, like I was talking about earlier, especially in like the NPC and federations like that, it's just the sport of bikini is what I was originally drawn to, and the original look of bikini, the sort of more feminine, um, curvier, less shredded look. And that's sort of coming out of bikini. Nowadays, it's just starting to become more and more shredded and leaner and more muscular, which not only isn't necessarily my personal goal for my physique, but also, like we were talking about, is very hard for most women to maintain. It's very, very hard on your body. And given that the sport is kind of airing more in that direction, we're starting to see a lot more women taking hormones and doing things that are not healthy. And I am very involved in fitness and nutrition because I believe in using it to enhance your life and not hinder your life. And I feel a lot of federations competing are not conducive to those goals.
Is there
That
any?
being also very expensive. It's an expensive hobby.
Yeah.
And if I don't have necessarily any goals to like be an IFBB pro or go compete on these huge stages, so in some sense, it is kind of a money drain sometimes, even though it's fun.
Yeah. Is there any form of competing that you plan on doing? Maybe like CrossFit or powerlifting or, something to, get your body to use your body to compete with other people with?
Um, Not really. Part of the reason that I like competing in bodybuilding shows so much is that I can turn it into sort of like a competition with myself. I'm
Hmm.
not very competitive towards other people, although I'm very competitive with myself. I'm very good at pushing myself and knowing that I individually can be better, but I don't even really like the idea of trying to compete with other people because what other people do is out of my control. So that's not really even very motivating to me, which is why I've never been huge into like competitive powerlifting or sports or CrossFit or even sports where I'm relying on things that are out of my control.
So you want to be in control of everything.
Yes, but I'm
Ooh,
independent.
we're learning big things about Kiana in this podcast.
I'm independent. I like to
Yeah.
have control over the things that I'm doing.
So I want to go back to you being hired at the Glute Lab. So you used to work at Genuine Fitness, like you said. Is there anything specifically you learned at Genuine Fitness that carried over in the Glute Lab? How are the two environments different?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much that I learned at Genuine Fitness that carries over every day in my training. I feel like Genuine Fitness back in Oregon is one of the best personal training gyms around. Just some of the most knowledgeable trainers, people who know what they're doing, people who are passionate. I learned a lot about bodybuilding, especially. They're very big on bodybuilding, but they also train just everyday clients. The owners, Aaron and Lindsay, have been doing this for a very long time, and they know a lot about various aspects of physique sports and just strength and conditioning in general. And I learned a lot from not only them, but also just training clients. Every day that you're in the gym training clients, you learn something new, or it sparks you to learn something new. You see something you haven't seen before and you want to research it more, or you come across a client who has an issue that maybe you haven't ever had to deal with, but now you're having to deal with that issue on a more personal level. So it inspires you to really learn about that issue and try to figure out the root cause, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I would say is very different about the two environments is the coaches that I'm working with now at the Glute Lab are strength and conditioning specialists, and they have a huge background in strength and conditioning, and they're super smart, knowledgeable dudes. But a lot of their training is or their experience has been strength, and their interests too. They're jujitsu fighters, so they're more interested in performance, conditioning, strength, whereas a lot of where I've come from is more physique and bodybuilding related.
That's weird,
Obviously,
huh?
yeah, it's kind
I've been working with like NCAA athletes and like football play. Like I know about the sports, but I don't know the sports like the coaches I'm working with, and it's totally like a culture shock, kind of, you know. So
It's very different. And then obviously at the Glute Lab, we do get a decent amount of physique competitors. And
what is the Glute Lab, real quick? So what do you guys do there?
so it's a private personal training facility. Basically, we do run things a little bit different than some private personal training facilities in that we do semi-private personal training. So we have individualized programming for all of our clients, meaning that all the trainers there will write our clients programs based on their goals, what they're looking to do, how often they're training, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone comes in there and they have their own program that they're following. But there is multiple clients on the floor at any given hour. So we can have up to 4 clients per trainer in there at once. So it's not truly one-on-one training. Um, and the man who opened it, Brett Contreras, he has a PhD and he specializes in glute training. So he's done the most research of anyone in the field specifically on the glutes. And not only glute hypertrophy, but also performance and strength aspects as well.
Why so why are the glutes so complicated? Like why has he done so much research on it? What are the nuances of glute training that we wouldn't see in like, you know, the chest training or why isn't there a back lab? You know what I mean? So
And that's a good question. And a big part of the reason is just because of the aesthetic demand, I think, for glutes. Every woman wants a nice butt. Like sometimes we'll get girls in there who are like, oh, I want to train 6 days a week. And we're like, okay, well, let's do an upper lower split and have you doing this on this day. And they're like, no, I just want to train glutes. I don't want to train upper body. And I mean, we can always do that. It's possible, but I think you're probably better off with a little bit more balance than that, first of all.
yeah.
But also, the glutes are just one of the least researched muscle groups in the field. Most of the research, especially pertaining to hypertrophy, has been done on extremities such as the quads or the hamstrings or the biceps, triceps. There's not a lot of direct glute research. And so that's a big thing that I think drove Brett into more research about the glutes, just so there could be more information available out there. There is some interesting differences in the glutes compared to other muscle groups, and I can't get into all of that right now, but one thing that's really interesting is that most muscle groups provide the most force in a lengthened position. Like the hamstrings, for example, will provide the most force in the lengthened position of, say, a deadlift. The glutes are really the opposite. They'll provide the most force in a shortened range of motion. So when you're really squeezing or clenching the glutes, for example, in a hip thrust, for those of you that are familiar with that exercise, that is, your glutes are the strongest, is when they're in a shortened range of motion, as opposed to an end range of motion, such as in a squat or a deadlift, which is part of the reason that hip extension movements can be a huge milestone in helping with the improve the aesthetic portion of the glutes and improve the strength of the glutes. It's also a factor that's left out of a lot of lower body training is hip extension and full glute flexion.
So what are some of the fundamental exercises that they've taught you there, and how do they directly benefit, your squat, your deadlift, your main lower body, your main lower extremity exercises?
So Brett who's the owner of the gym, is also the inventor of the hip thrust, the exercise, the hip thrust. So we do tons of different hip thrusting variation there. We have just the regular barbell hip thrust setup. We have the Smith machine hip thrust. We have his invention called the Scorcher. We have the Booty Builder, which is sort of like the cable counterpart to a barbell hip thrust. We have the Glute Builder, and we have multiple different stances. We use bands, we use bars. So hip thrusts are a huge one because they're just so universal. There's so many different variations that you can do, and they do have the glutes in that shortened range of motion where they're going to be the strongest. We focus a lot on incorporating a lot of that range of motion. It's also beneficial because that range of motion you can use a little bit more volume with that range of motion in your lower body training because it's not as hard to recover from. It doesn't cause as much muscle damage. So you can do it a little bit more frequently or with a little bit higher volume. Things like rounded glute emphasis back extensions, various variants of the kickback, hip thrust are big focuses at the Glute Lab. We also focus a lot on abduction exercises, things where you're moving the legs away from the midline. Those tend to be very effective in targeting the gluteus medius and the upper subdivision of the glute max, which is sort of that shelf booty, quote unquote, that many people refer to. It's kind of hard to target in a lot of other exercises. And those exercises can carry over very well to things like your more compound moves, deadlifts, squats. There's been a lot of research on how the hip thrust relates to things like sprint speed and performance as well, showing hip thrust to be beneficial in training a lot of athletes for speed and agility. It also helps a lot if you are someone who struggles, like in a deadlift, in the top range of motion to really lock out that range of motion. It's essentially the same motion as a hip thrust. So locking out the hips and practicing that locking out the hips can be very helpful in strength movements like deadlifts, or even locking out the hips at the top of a squat.
So you mentioned that that a lot of these exercises you rebound a lot faster, you recover a lot faster, and because you guys have broken up the glutes into so many parts, is there a way you program glute training that is very unique to your gym? Do you split up different parts of the glutes to different days? Do you do a sort of training that's like every other day? What sort of progression do you guys use over there? Is there a very specific reason to use resistance bands, a very specific reason to use these machines?
Well, yes. We don't, or I don't, all of the coaches program their own clients' training. So It's a little bit individualized, but we do all program pretty similarly. We don't necessarily break up different like parts of the glutes, like gluteus medius on this day, gluteus maximus on this day,
Meat
because
day, bro.
but there are multiple different ranges of motion that we like to make sure the glutes are being taken through in any given workout. For example, a knee flexion exercise like a squat or a lunge or something like that. A hip flexion exercise like a deadlift or something like that. A hip extension exercise like I was talking about, the hip thrust, rounded back extension, and an abduction exercise, so something where you're moving the leg away from the midline. We like to make sure those are incorporated in all programs throughout the week in some way. Just to incorporate exercise variety, make sure you're hitting all the subdivisions of the glutes and make sure you're hitting the glutes from multiple different angles. You're going to get the biggest benefit with a little bit of variety in that way. That being said, how the program looks exactly is going to be very inter-individual, dependent on the person and their genetics and how well they recover, how much volume they can tolerate, what their specific goals are, how often they want to train, how lean they are, how much they eat, how well they recover, their stress levels. There's so many different factors. It's hard to even just give a blanket statement about how to structure glute training because it is so individual.
So how has working there changed the way that you structure your programs? Has it completely just like demolished everything you knew before and you're just reorganizing it now that you work there? Or are you just taking pieces of it and adding it in? Or are you just kind of going about it the same way that you did before?
No, my training and my programs were actually very similar already to how Brett and his other trainers program and train clients, and that's still just kind of the general base knowledge. But of course, like I was talking about earlier, every day that you're in the gym training, you learn something new. So I am picking up new pieces and always learning new stuff and always avidly researching everything pertaining to nutrition and exercise, and always trying to just learn the next thing and adding more pieces. But there is kind of a base level that's remained that I don't feel the need to completely scratch off and start from new, because I feel like my training even beforehand was still based on pretty sound principles, even though I'm picking up more and more as time goes on.
Okay, cool. I'm going to shoot you some like one-off questions and we can
All right.
spend as much time as you want on them. Is there a new piece of equipment that you've been using that you really like?
Absolutely. So there's two pieces at the Glute Lab that we have that I've never used anywhere else. One of them is the Booty Builder, which, like I was talking about earlier, is like the cable counterpart to a barbell hip thrust. That's like right now, it changes from time to time, but right now it's like by far and above my favorite way to hip thrust.
Mm-hmm.
The cable stack is really nice and heavy. You get a full range of motion. You get the best pump. And then we also have an apparatus called a lever squat, which was made by Tough Stuff and was discontinued about 15 years ago. And it's kind of similar to like a reverse hack squat. It's plate loaded, and the weight goes up on your shoulders and you sit back sort of into a squat motion. But it just feels like a really good range of motion. It's less stressful on the knees than a regular squat. And a lot of our clients that have either knee problems or back problems are still able to squat with that machine because it's not very stressful on the low back and it's not very stressful on the knees. And it, depending on how you do it, you can lean back a little bit further, you can stay a little bit more upright, but there is the potential to target a large degree of glutes there. And I can get a lot of clients who wouldn't normally feel glutes during a squat to really feel their glutes during that lever squat.
Okay. What is one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you first started training?
Oh my gosh, so many things.
What's the holy grail? What's the holy grail of Kiana?
There's really is so many that are like way up there on the list, but if there's one thing I had to choose, it would probably be that working harder doesn't always get you better results. I think that work ethic is a great quality, and I think that a lot of people, this is going to sound kind of bitchy, but I think it's true. I think a lot of people don't train hard enough to achieve the results that they're trying to achieve. But it's also important to realize that just because you're working hard doesn't mean you're doing anything right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What resources do you go to when you're researching nutrition and training?
I like to draw from multiple different places, but a lot of times if I'm just like browsing the net or just looking for some new research or a way to become more educated, I just will go in straight into Google and type NCBI
Mm-hmm.
and whatever I want to research. And that will pull up a lot of PubMed
Studies.
articles that are usually pretty reliable. I also am subscribed to a couple research reviews. Alan Aragon has a great research review. There's a research review called MASS, it's MASS, by some very knowledgeable professionals in the field, such as Eric Helms. There's a couple things like that. Mike Zordos is a good form of information. Lane Newton, and then Brett Contreras, of course, I think is very knowledgeable. Brad Schoenfeld, like I mentioned, Alan Aragon, James Krieger. These are all just some guys who have blogs and podcasts and articles that I'm always trying to stay up to date on because they're all very knowledgeable in the field of exercise and nutrition.
Well, awesome, Kiana. Thank you for coming through, having a very informative conversation with me on a Friday night. Where can they find you?
So I am on Instagram at Nirvana Fit. My website is linked in my bio there, but I do also have a website. It's www.nirvanafittraining.com. I'm not very active on Facebook, but you can find me on Facebook if you want to, Kiana Nirvana Loomis. And those are my main social media platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for stopping by this week. You can catch a Zercast every Thursday. Always bringing you quality content. Always bringing you the best people with the best information. Catch us next week. Have a good one.
See you guys.